I think it is inevitable. I mean, all wealthy aging societies have migration. So you cannot be a wealthy society, an aging society on the one hand, and not accept immigration. On the other hand, immigration cannot solve the structural problems. I mean, South Korea is the country with the lowest fertility rate in the world. So migration can never solve that problem. So although it's true that aging will increase shortages of labor, which are already very big in the South Korean labor market and will certainly attract more migrants in the future, it is an illusion, on the other hand, that immigration can solve the aging problem. So the aging problem needs to be tackled in very different ways.
There is one of the worry is that if we get more migration labor workers, that they will take away, especially the young people's job.
Yeah, migrants don't take jobs, they come to vacancies. That is a broad pattern. It's simply not true. There is a lot of scientific evidence showing that immigration is not leading to more unemployment. Immigration doesn't massively bring down wages or things like that. It is really the labor market shortages that create migration. If employers can't find, employers would prefer to hire a Korean worker. It's much easier. It costs less money. There's a real shortage, there's a real lack for certain jobs, and that is actually what's driving migration. Now, I can understand that young people and low-skilled workers are worried about the fact that it is more difficult to get a job, and it is more difficult if you do low-skilled jobs to make ends meet, to pay your bills. But that is not because of immigration, that is because of the economic policies we've been pursuing for the last 30 years. Sort of the liberalization of our economy that meant that it's become more difficult to secure a stable job, to gain a decent salary. And the only way to fix that is a change in economic and taxation policies and increase labor protection for lower skilled workers. The only way to fix that is to put pressure on politicians to reverse those policies.
One of the issues that always are raised by especially politicians that when we talk about migration is if we accept more foreign workers, that the crime rates will go up.
Well, first off, international comparative research has showed that immigrants are less criminal than non-immigrants. And the reason is quite simple, is that most migrants are very hardworking, motivated people, conservative, family-oriented. They want to succeed, they don't want to get in trouble. Certainly a migrant doesn't want to get in trouble. Of course, there will be some migrants who are criminals like any person, but on average, we see in research that most migrants are actually less criminal than native workers. Of course, there could be groups in the second generation once people integrate, and that is the irony, that increasing criminality is the downside of integration. And native-born people actually are more criminal than immigrants. If you look at welfare more broadly, migrants are great contributors to welfare. Think about all the care workers, that's welfare too. Where would our welfare system go without migrants, and in the future increasingly so? Well, there may be some migrants, certainly the second generation, that are above average unemployed or rely more on benefits than others. But again, on average, immigrants actually work and bring in money rather than they take out of the system. Of course, you would need to avoid problems of integration and segregation on the longer term, and that can in the longer term lead to problems of unemployment and welfare dependency. That is why it's so important to make sure migrants can work, can participate in society, and it also means they will feel at home, they will work, and they will pay tax and contribute. But both ideas that immigration undermines welfare or increases crimes are simply myths that are not sustained by any evidence whatsoever.
As we're seeing wars again and more conflicts than before, we thought in the 21st century we won't see as much because the war is starting. They have more people migrating because of that. And then also we hear about, because of the climate crisis, that we will have huge people also migrating.
Many people think, and it is very common, I think it's the biggest migration myth around perhaps these days, that climate change will lead to massive international migration. Actually, this idea is not based on any evidence at all. It's also based on a wrong analysis of what actually causes migration. There is this big misunderstanding that migration is a problem, is a reaction to crisis, that migrants are desperate, that migration is a form of desperate departure. And what we know from research is that by and large, migration is an investment in a better future. And certainly if you want to migrate over long distances, so I'm not talking about, of course, climate change could displace people. And we already know that, for instance, droughts and floods, whether they are related to climate change or not, do displace people. But we also know from research that most of this displacement is short distance. So people move to the next village or where they can find a safe haven. And most people actually try to go back after that. The idea that climate change will lead to massive transcontinental movements of migrants doesn't take the evidence into account that migration is actually very expensive, requires a lot of resources, is an investment, that the biggest victims of climate change in any form of crisis, whether political, economic or environmental, will not have the means to move over large distances. And that explains the paradox that impoverishment, whether this is through drought or economic crisis or other problems, actually immobilizes people. It means that people can no longer go, they get stuck. And the biggest victims of climate change, and our concern should go out to people who cannot move at all, who get stuck in dangerous situations. So we have to reverse our perspective of migration, and this is also what I try to do in my book. So we need a very different vision of migration, not as a response to problems, but it's a part of development. It is only when countries get richer that more people start to migrate. It's a big paradox.
Is there anything more that you would like to advise us related to Korean situation?
Perhaps my biggest advice to Korea would be, don't think that Korea is an exception or could be an exception on any rule. Look at experiences. I think Germany is a very good example. Look at experiences of countries that also come from a past where ethnic homogeneity was a big issue, and Germany was one of those examples. And I think look at those examples and look at the errors those countries have made in the past and how they have fixed those errors, and learn from experiences from countries that have gone through the same process already in the previous decades. Then you better have policies in action that try to acknowledge that reality, which means you actually can control it better. If you deny the reality, migration will happen anyway, and then you don't control it anymore. It means migration will increasingly become illegal. We no longer control who's coming in, who's going, so you better have a policy in place that actually try to regulate it. But if that is based on denial of reality, and also an illusion that these all will be temporary workers, because that's what politicians often do. Because faced with the reality that of pressures from employers, from the society, like we need more migrants to take care of people, to work in industries and so on and so forth, politicians will easily say, they're only going to be hit temporarily. And that's exactly what happened in Western Europe with the guest workers. That politicians in the Netherlands and Germany said, these are just guests, they will go back one day. So they create this illusion to create political support for immigration policy. But actually it's quite dangerous, because by always treating people like guests, it sounds good in the beginning, but in the end it means that people will never feel part of society. So do set up programs that encourage migrants to learn the language, to feel part of Korea. Set up legislation that makes it easy for migrants to gain permanent residence and earn their way into citizenship, in the sense of people who work hard, contribute to Korean society. You also create incentives for migrants to contribute. But there needs, of course, to be a reward for that, and that is inevitably about also reaching out to migrants. So I would say don't think Korea as an exception. And learn from experience of countries who've been through this before. I think that will be my biggest advice.